There was a ton of movement in this past week's AP poll due to some surprising upsets and some absolute stupidity. But there are still some major problems with the AP poll, in my opinion, so I'm going to do my own. And with that out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we are going to be talking about the AP Top 25, as well as giving you my own Top 25, and maybe something a little extra. But let's start off with the AP poll. Number 1 and 2 remain unchanged, while Ohio State and Florida State both slide up one spot due to Texas's loss. Oklahoma jumps 7 spots to number 5. Penn State and Washington and Oregon all remain where they were last week, 6, 7, 8, as they all had bye weeks, I believe. Texas falls all the way to 9. USC falls to 10 after their scare against Arizona. Alabama remains at 11. North Carolina jumps 2 spots. Ole Miss jumps 3 spots. Louisville jumps 11 spots after dominating Notre Dame in the second half of that game. Oregon State remains at 15. Utah jumps 2 spots just because teams that were ranked ahead of them lost. Duke at 17, same sort of deal. They jumped 2 spots because teams ahead of them lost. UCLA jumps all the way from unranked to 18 after beating Washington State, who fell 6 spots. Tennessee goes up 2 spots. Notre Dame falls 11 spots. LSU is up 1. Kansas is in after being unranked. Kentucky falls 4 spots, and Miami falls 8 spots. Well, obviously, my first pair of big problems with this is the title of the video. How in the hell are Notre Dame and Miami still ranked? Neither deserves to be ranked. You can still believe that they are 2 of the 25 best teams in America, but that's not how rankings work. Rankings are based on what you have done in the season, or at least they should be. And Notre Dame and Miami really haven't beaten anybody. I mean, Notre Dame beat North Carolina State, but they're not anything fantastic this year. And Miami beat Texas A&M, but they're good. They're not a great team, in my opinion. I did have them ranked last week, but they're a solid team. They're not great or anything. But Miami lost to be quite honestly, a bad Georgia Tech team in the most ridiculous and idiotic manner imaginable. They do not deserve to be ranked, in my opinion. And Notre Dame, after getting blown out by Louisville, who I think is a good, not great team, to go along with the shit show that was the last drive against Ohio State, I don't think they should be ranked either. I think there are more deserving teams to be ranked than Miami and Notre Dame. So let me put my money where my mouth is here, and let's do my own top 25. At 25, I have Air Force, who absolutely deserves to be ranked after going 6-0, and absolutely deserves to be in the conversation for best group of 5 team in the country right now. At 24, I have Missouri, who just barely clings on to being ranked after the loss to LSU. I do think LSU is a good team. I was extraordinarily high on that team heading into this season. They have proven me wrong so far. I mean, they are what they are. They're a team with a borderline elite offense and an absolutely abysmal defense. If they can end up going 9-3 or something like that, maybe we can get a USC and LSU matchup in some minor bowl game this year, which would be thoroughly entertaining. But Missouri, I also think, are what they are. And that's, I think they're certainly in the discussion for being the second best team in the SEC East. It's probably either Missouri, Kentucky, or Tennessee, but that's going to sort itself out here pretty soon. Like, Kentucky and Missouri play each other this week. Tennessee plays Alabama 2 weeks from now. Not to overlook Texas A&M by any means if you're Tennessee, but I think we all kind of have realized with this past week that Georgia is still the best team in the country, and they're likely going to walk through the SEC to a 13-0 record and breeze into the playoffs. So if I'm Tennessee, I don't particularly care if we lose to Texas A&M this year. I would like to put pretty much all of my focus into beating Alabama because of the rivalry status of that game and because you didn't really win for like 20 years or whatever it was until last year. So losing again this year would kind of make that game seem like a blip in the radar, like a once in a blue moon sort of thing. But if you win this year, it could be similar to Michigan beating Ohio State last year in the sense that, oh, okay, this is back to being a rivalry now. This isn't just Goliath and a pushover. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent that I didn't particularly need to go on. At 23, I have Wyoming, who's the same sort of story as Air Force. I think they deserve to be in the conversation for the best group of 5 team. I have Kentucky falling 6 spots. They got dealt by a Georgia team that seems to have finally figured it all out and reestablished themselves as clearly the best team in the country. Kansas at 21. I was always sort of high on this Kansas team. I like them. I think they're kind of sneaky, maybe to get an upset or two and end up with a much better record than I think people anticipated, like maybe 9-3 or even 10-2. We just have to hope that Jalen Daniels can come back because this is a different team with him at quarterback. Like they're a good offense when he's not on the field, but when he's on the field, they might be an elite offense. So he is a very important player for them, and I hope he can get healthy. At 20, I have LSU simply because I like this team. I really like Jaden Daniels, and I really like the offense. Unfortunately, Brian Kelly is going to need to get his defense figured out, which I just don't think is going to happen this year, but they do have somewhat of a manageable schedule the rest of the season. Like, I think they're clearly better than Auburn. I think they're clearly better than Army. Then they play Alabama on November 4th, and honestly, who knows how that game is going to go? I don't know at all. I think Alabama's defense is a little bit overrated, but LSU's defense is also abysmal, so I think it'll probably be a shootout, and in those kinds of games, anybody can win, so maybe they can win that game, and then they play Florida, which I think would be an upset spot, and then Georgia State and Texas A&M to end the year. That's honestly a pretty manageable schedule. I would be a little bit more concerned about Texas A&M if Connor Wingman was still able to play this year, but without him, I think that team is significantly worse. So I'm not all that worried about that game. I am worried because the defense sucks, but there's a decent chance this team ends up 10-2. And if they were to win out, they would only need Ole Miss to lose one game in order to guarantee themselves a spot in the SEC championship game, which seems pretty likely to me. It seems pretty likely that Ole Miss is going to lose a football game, as they do play Georgia on November 11th. So LSU kind of controls their own destiny in the SEC. Either way, I think they would just get absolutely bodied by Georgia in the SEC championship game for 2 straight years. But if Brian Kelly manages to salvage an SEC championship game appearance out of this team, I think that would reestablish a lot of confidence that people have in this program right now and the direction that it is heading. The AP and I are of similar thoughts on Washington State and UCLA, that being Washington State falls to 19 and UCLA jumps from unranked to 18. As far as Washington State goes, Cam Ward really had his first bad game at Washington State. I don't remember him ever looking like that last year, and I think it had more to do with UCLA's defense doing a lot of complicated sort of NFL stuff and also just flat out being really, really good, more than it had to do with him making mistakes. I haven't watched film on that game, but that's just sort of the vibe I got when I watched the game live. UCLA, on the other hand, I think is a team built for next year, not this year, and I think they are going to greatly benefit by moving into the Big Ten and that style of football rather than the Pac-12 style of football. There's also a good chance that a lot of other teams from the old Pac 12 moving into the Big Ten and also the Big Ten are going to get significantly worse next year. Now, I know they don't play Michigan, but Michigan is going to be way worse next year than they are this year. I think there's a good chance Washington has to enter a little bit of a rebuilding year. They're going to be losing their top two wide receivers and their quarterback, as well as several other pieces on defense. Oregon, it's the same deal. They're going to be losing their wide receiver one, their quarterback, likely their running back as well, a few offensive linemen. I think they're probably entering into a rebuilding year as well next year. But I think UCLA is actually going to get better. Now, they're going to lose Leatu, the defensive end, who's going to go in the first round and is just phenomenally underrated in terms of like the national perspective right now. That'll change in the offseason. But he's very, very good. The rest of the defense, they're losing a few more pieces, but a lot of the more impactful players are likely to be back, in my opinion. I would also like to remind people that COVID years are still a thing. So even though somebody's a fifth-year senior, that doesn't mean that they can't come back next year, because I think some people might be forgetting that, because I've had conversations where people are like, this guy's a redshirt senior, he can't come back next year. No, COVID year, that's still a thing. Ole Miss at 17, and I don't know what it's going to take for me to believe in this team, but I just don't believe in this team. I don't think they're very good. Now, I've got to rank them this high because they have proven it. They've beaten LSU. They've what I think is an underrated Arkansas team who, if they played in a different conference, would have a much better record. This week they have a bye week, and then they play Auburn at Auburn, which they probably should win. Then they play Vanderbilt. Then they play Texas A&M, and then Georgia. So they kind of have like a perfect little ramp up here between Vanderbilt, Texas A&M, and Georgia. If they can get past Texas A&M, they have a very good chance of ending the season 10-2, which is not something I thought would have happened heading into this season. I think I predicted 7-5 for them. I don't think I made a video predicting the SEC, but I think I went 7. I think I did write down 7-5 next to Ole Miss's name when I just did it myself. And they've proven me wrong there. They're much better than I thought they were, but I don't buy into them. It would probably, if they beat Georgia, I can buy into them, but they're in Athens, Georgia for that game. I think Georgia is going to be looking to bolster their playoff stance as much as they can. I mean, they're going to be number one the entire time. I don't think they're going to lose a game. I think they're going to be number one. And I think, honestly, right now, they probably are going to three-peat. But you never know what happens any given Saturday, you know what they say. Utah at 16, it sort of came out this week that Cam Rising didn't just tear his ACL this past year, he also tore his MCL, his meniscus, and basically every other muscle and ligament in his knee. And if that's the case, it's a miracle he is able to walk, let alone be trying to come back to play college football. I think he's very likely to medically redshirt this year and come back next season, their first season in the Big 12. And without Cam Rising, I just do not believe that Utah is going to be a team that can legitimately compete against any team not named USC in the Pac-12. In terms of like Oregon or Washington, I think those two teams should probably roll past Utah without any resistance. And with USC looking as bad as they have looked, I think the Pac-12 has effectively become a two-team conference with Oregon and Washington in regards to the playoffs. At 15, I have Tennessee, and I do not think Tennessee is a top 15 caliber team in the country, but I don't have anybody else to put them here. The fact of the matter is that they only have one loss, which was a rivalry game to a not very good Florida team, but it was a rivalry game, and Tennessee's offense is very much, if we're on, then we're going to put up 40, and if we're off, we're going to struggle to get to 15. So I don't really know what Tennessee is. Hopefully, or for them, hopefully they can show up offensively against Alabama, and maybe if that happens, you can consider the season a success for Josh Heupel. But I think with the amount of hype entering this season, some of which was warranted and a lot of which turns out was unwarranted, it would be hard to consider this season a success without beating Alabama, at least. If you beat Alabama, you could probably end up 10-2 unless you slip up somewhere else. But I do like Tennessee. I do like Josh Heupel. Joe Milton is really weird because he doesn't play like he's an extraordinarily physically talented football player. He plays almost like he's scared to really show off his talent. Like he doesn't really move around. He's pretty much just being a pocket passer when he could run around and do other things. I don't know. It's a really weird situation. I do think I am going to make a breakdown of Joe Milton in Tennessee at some point this season, but it's not going to be this Wednesday. Oregon State at 14. This is a team I really like. This team. I think this team has a decent chance to get to double-digit wins this season with a bowl game win. I think DJ Uyunglele has been really, really good and transformed himself back into sort of being a draftable NFL quarterback prospect. Now, I think he could use a COVID year and come back next year for Oregon State, which would be the move for me if I was him in that situation, because 2025 quarterback class is much weaker than 2024 quarterback class. But I've also been saying that about Cam Rising and a lot of other quarterbacks as well. So maybe 2025 is going to end up being better than 2024 because you got all these quarterbacks being like, I can't compete with the top 4 or 5 quarterbacks of 2024. So why even bother to go out this year? I'll just stay at home. I don't know, but that's a problem for the offseason. Oregon State is a good football team. They have a really, really good young head coach, and I don't know what they're going to do after this season, but for this season, I think they're legitimately one of the better teams in the country. I have Louisville rising 12 spots all the way to 13. And if you put a imaginary matchup between Louisville and USC and ask me to pick who would win, I would pick Louisville in that game. I do think USC has maybe just slightly proven a little bit more than Louisville, but we are going to have a comparative game this week because USC is going to play Notre Dame. So if USC dominates Notre Dame, which I don't think is going to happen, but if they do, then all of a sudden maybe USC and Louisville, you can talk about that being more of a closer game in my opinion, but I think Louisville would win by a significant margin. I told you last week heading into the Notre Dame game, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, I don't remember, but I told you to watch out for Louisville in the ACC. That is a sneaky, sneaky team that dodges North Carolina, Clemson, and Florida State. They don't play any of those 3 teams. They play Pittsburgh this next week, followed by Duke, Virginia Tech, Virginia, Miami, and Kentucky to end the season. You can make the argument that Kentucky is the toughest game, and that's not in conference. So if they lose that game, it doesn't particularly matter. It might matter in a playoff sense, but I don't think Louisville is an actual playoff contender. If they do somehow end up going 13-0, that would be spectacular, and they absolutely would make the playoffs. But I don't really think they would be able to compete with anybody that is likely also going to make the playoffs in that scenario. They have to get by Duke and Miami. Those, I think, are tough games. Pittsburgh could be a little bit of a trap game, but they do have a bye week after this weekend against Pittsburgh, so maybe not. They get a bye week to play Duke. Now, sometimes that hurts teams, sometimes that helps teams. I don't particularly know if that would hurt or help them, but they do have a bye week heading into that Duke game. Then they play Virginia Tech, who isn't very good, and then they play Virginia, who's absolutely horrible, and then they play Miami after a 9-day rest. So they're going to have a little bit more time to game plan for that game, and then they end the season against Kentucky, which is going to be a phenomenal matchup. I'm very excited for that game. And this Louisville team is sneaky. They just need to survive against Pittsburgh, come out motivated to play against Duke, get past Virginia Tech and Virginia without looking too far ahead, and then beat Miami. And if they do that, they are in the ACC championship game, which is fantastic. I would love for Louisville to be in the ACC championship game. However, there is also a scenario here that is absolutely hilarious involving Louisville, North Carolina, and Florida State. Neither of those 3 teams play each other at all. So hypothetically, Florida State could win out. They play Syracuse, then Duke, then Wake Forest, Pittsburgh, Miami, North Alabama, and Florida to end the season. So they could fairly easily win out. North Carolina plays Miami this week, then Virginia, Georgia Tech, Campbell, Duke at home, just like Florida State, Clemson away, and North Carolina away. So North Carolina could end up winning out, although I do think it is a more difficult path than Florida State or Louisville. But all three of those teams could win out, and it would just be spectacularly hilarious to me, who hates the idea of the best two teams playing each other in the conference championship game. I absolutely hate that idea. I think you need to have divisions within the conferences, especially if you're going to have 16, 18, 20 teams, because scenarios like this can arise with 14 teams. And I desperately want it to happen because it would be absolutely hilarious, and I think it would have to force a lot of these conferences to go back to a more interesting form of college football where there are divisions within each conference. But getting back on track here, USC, I have them at 12. They honestly should be lower. I do not believe in this team at all. I think they are the fakest team in college football, and I think they are going to get ass blasted by Oregon and Washington because I don't think USC's defense is capable of stopping either of those offenses even once. And I think both of their defenses are capable of getting at least one or two stops in that game. So I think USC is going to dramatically fall in the polls in the next few weeks, and I think there needs to be some serious questions surrounding Lincoln Riley and how he is operating that program. At number 11, I have Alabama. They're a good football team. Jalen Milroe appears to be getting better every single week, and I do think that there is a scenario where Alabama ends up going 11-1 in the regular season and beats Georgia in the SEC championship game in order for them to make the playoffs. I do think that is possible because Georgia's weakness this year has been the quarterback run game. So if Alabama can lean on Jalen Milroe in that game, which I'm not sure they're going to because they have gone away from the quarterback run the past few weeks. But in that game, they might say, fuck it, we need Jalen Milroe's legs to win this game, which they should. But they have a serious chance of winning that game. They are ranked 11 currently because of the loss to Texas. At number 10, I have Texas, who fell 8 spots from number 2 to number 10. I kind of stopped them at number 10 because Alabama was at 11, and they did beat Alabama, but Texas lost to Oklahoma this past week, and I'm not so much concerned that they lost to Oklahoma. It was the way that they lost, and it wasn't that it was a last-second touchdown or anything like that. Texas got manhandled on both sides of the football in that game. That game had no right being that close. Oklahoma should have blown them out. I watched every play of that game and then rewatched it again later. Oklahoma left, I think, 21 points on the field simply because of sometimes bad play calling, sometimes luck, and sometimes a kid just couldn't make a play. But that game should not have been as close as it was. But the better team did end up winning, in my opinion. I have North Carolina at 9. I don't really understand why they're so low in the AP poll. This is clearly a top 10 team in the country based off of what they've done this year. Like, nobody wants to talk about it, but North Carolina has had the most difficult schedule in college football this year. They opened up against a decent South Carolina team in a Power 5 matchup. Then they won a rivalry game against a good App State team. Now, it did go to overtime, but that was a rivalry game, and App State was trying to revenge last year, so that is very impressive to me. They then play Minnesota, whose defense is a good defense, and they put up 30 points on that defense. They then beat Pittsburgh the following week. They then beat a undefeated Syracuse team this past week, and now this week they play Miami and Florida, and if they win that game, I don't know how in the hell people can keep them out of the top 10, because Miami is still a good team, and I do think they're going to come out motivated to play after what happened last week. They then effectively have 3 bye weeks against Virginia, Georgia Tech, and Campbell. Then they have Duke at home. And I've already gone over their schedule, but their final 3 games, I think they're going 9-0. And then their final 3 games are really going to decide if they're going to make the ACC championship game and potentially the playoff. So I think this North Carolina team is very underrated. I think they are legitimately a contending team for the playoff. So I'm going to talk about Oregon and Penn State together, and then we're going to talk about Oklahoma to end this segment here. So we're going to go a little bit out of order. But Oregon and Penn State both had bye weeks this past week, and I believe that there is a really good chance that they are both the best teams in their conferences that are ranked below other teams in their conferences in both the AP poll and my poll, simply because of who they've played and the fact that the other teams might just have a better chance of winning that game because they have an absolutely elite unit on one side of the ball, as opposed to Oregon, who I think has a great offense and a great defense, but not an elite offense or an elite defense. Like, if you look at Washington, I think Washington has an elite offense and a good defense. If you look at Ohio State, I think they have an elite defense and an average offense. So having an elite half of football, like having an elite offense or defense, is more preferable than being great on both sides of the ball, because that means that you can take over a game with that unit, and I don't think Oregon has that in them. I don't think they can take over a game with their offense or their defense. Penn State, I think, might be the only team in the country other than Georgia that has the potential to have an elite offense and an elite defense. Now, this year, the defense has been elite and the offense has been good to at times great. But I think there is another level that offense can hit, and I am really, really excited about this Penn State team. We will talk about them more in the bonus surprise segment at the end of this video. Oklahoma is the last team that we're going to talk about here in this 10-6 segment. Oklahoma has so far this season been very quietly great on both sides of the football. I think them and Oregon are very similar teams. I think Bo Nix is better than Dillon Gabriel, but that is a conversation. I think Bucky Irving is better than the Oklahoma stable of running backs, but that is a conversation. However, I think Oklahoma's defense is better than Oregon's offense, and if they both end up going like 12-1 or 11-2 or something like that, I would be ecstatic to see a matchup between these two teams because they are very similar, and I think it would be really, really good TV to watch. Mike Venerables has done a fantastic job in year 2. I was not high on Oklahoma at all heading into the season. I did not buy into the hype, and I still don't buy into the hype once they get into the SEC, but that's a conversation for next year. This year, this is a legitimately contending team for the playoffs, and once they get there, you never know what can happen. So I think Oklahoma is a really, really, really good football team. Jumping into the top 5, I think this is what the consensus pretty much should be. At number 5, I have Washington, who I've kind of spoken about tangentially, but I think this is a elite offense with potentially the Heisman front runner at quarterback. Dillon Gabriel, I think, has elevated himself into being that front runner for the Heisman position so far after last week. But Michael Penix, I think, has a better chance of ending up winning the Heisman than Dillon Gabriel does, simply because I think Washington has a better chance of going 12-1, 13-0, and winning their conference. But Oklahoma still has a good chance of doing that as well. Washington, as a football team, I think is a little bit underrated and under-talked about because they don't have a pushover defense. That defense can play defense when they need to play defense. And it is very, very difficult to play defense for a team that scores in 3 plays, like 7 times a game. So that is going to limit the ceiling of your defense. But I think Washington has just about as good of a defense that you can have with that level of offense. And because of that, I think they're the best team in the Pac-12. Now, this week they play Oregon, and we're going to figure out if they're the best team in the Pac-12 or not. But I think right now they are the best team in the Pac-12, and I would pick them to beat Oregon. We will talk about that in Friday's video where we preview the games. But Oregon still has a good chance of winning that game. I just think Washington has it this year, the it factor. so to speak. I have Michigan jumping Washington, which is something I was very hesitant to do. But when I compare these two teams, I think Michigan, who these past 2 weeks has kind of figured some shit out, they've been able to rush the passer the past 2 weeks, which is not something we saw early on in the season from them. And the offense has sort of finally started to really click and become unstoppable. And I think that was largely because they kind of stopped dicking around with Donovan Edwards. And that's astonishing to say to me, but Donovan Edwards does not deserve to be getting carries right now. Now, this past week, he was good as a scat back and a third down back. He caught a couple of passes and had like 25, 30 yards. But that probably should be his role going forward, where it's 3rd and 10 and you need a running back to run a route. So we're going to bring in Donovan Edwards. I think that's probably going to be his role for this season because he has not been the same player this year that he was as a freshman, and not even in a discussion, he's not the same player that he was last year. And I don't really know why. I think the only thing that I could say is that he did put on some weight from this offseason to past this season, so that might be limiting his explosiveness and his agility, but he had the frame to put on the weight, unlike Blake Corum. But I don't particularly understand what has caused him to not be great. But the final thing that I want to talk about with Michigan offensively is they are finally playing their 5 best offensive linemen. I don't understand how Miles Hinton was playing early on in the season. He wasn't great. In fact, he was easily their worst offensive lineman when he was playing. And Carson Barnhart at left tackle was not great either. But now they're playing Ladarius Henderson, who I think, not as a tackle, but as a guard, has a first-round caliber chance to go in the NFL, like in the first round. So I do not understand how they could possibly have justified keeping him on the bench these first 5-6 games here. But the past 2 weeks when he's been playing, he has been fantastic, and it has completely changed Michigan's offensive line from a unit that was just good to now genuinely being what I think is an elite caliber unit and maybe the best in the country. Defensively for Michigan, I kind of talked about it a little bit, but they finally figured out how to rush the passer, and they're starting to get healthy in the secondary. Will Johnson starting to look like his old self from the second half of last season, had that pick 6. Rod Moore seems to be beating off the rust a little bit and ending up better. Bakari Page hasn't really taken that leap that I've expected him to play, but he's still a very good football player. Keon Saab has stepped up in that R.J. Morton role and been a really good player. Zeke Berry, who was not playing this past week, but has been very good as a backup slot. Mike Sandershills has been fantastic at the slot corner so far this year. The linebacking core is maybe a little bit concerning. Ernest Hausman has kind of gotten bullied a little bit at that position. He just seems a little bit small, or doesn't have a whole lot of functional strength for whatever reason, but he is rotation linebacker there. They're only really playing 2 linebackers most of the time. Junior Colson has taken a step forward. I think he solidified himself as a day 2 prospect in this upcoming draft class. Assuming he goes out, he might not. And Michael Barrett, I think, has a good chance to get drafted in the later rounds as a will linebacker with special teams upside, kind of like a Khalil Hudson sort of situation. But the linebacking core has kind of been the most disappointing. Mason Graham looks like an absolute superstar. Chris Jenkins is really, really good and getting better, especially in the pass rush as the season goes on. He might work his way into being like defensive tackle 2 or 3 in this class. He's not getting past Jerzon Newton, but that is what it is. I do think he is somebody who could thrive in either scheme as a pure 3 technique or as a 3-4 defensive end at the next level. I think he's versatile like that. So Chris Jenkins is really, really good. Mason Graham has looked phenomenal. He might end up being a first-round prospect in 2025. And corner 2 has kind of been figured out a little bit with some rotations at that position. I think this is a really, really good team with a great to elite defense, and to be entirely honest with you, a great to elite offense. I said earlier that Penn State and Georgia were the 2 teams that had the ability to be elite on offense and elite on defense. I kind of misspoke because I kind of just forgot Michigan existed for a minute, because I think Michigan has that potential too. I think those are the three teams that have the potential to be elite on both sides of the football. Ohio State and Florida State to me are kind of two halves of the same coin. I think Ohio State has an elite defense with some problems on offense, and I think Florida State has a great to elite offense when they're clicking, and some problems on defense. I have them both ranked ahead of Michigan, even though I think Michigan is better than both of them because of what they've done so far this season. Ohio State does have a win over at least a decent team, which I don't know if Michigan has a win over a decent team so far this year. I think Minnesota is decent, but if you ask me who would win, Minnesota or Notre Dame, I'm going to take Notre Dame in that game, but I do think it would be close. So I give Ohio State a slight edge right now. And Florida State, they have beaten a ranked LSU team, but the real impressive thing about that game is that they held them to 17 points, and nobody else has been able to come anywhere near that. Now, after that game, Florida State's defense has not looked great, but I think that was largely a motivation problem. I think this Florida State team is in cruise control right now, and that does mean that they could get upset by somebody, but they do have a fairly easy schedule the rest of the way. They've gotten all of their tough games out of the way. I think Florida State is probably still the best team in the ACC, though North Carolina and Louisville both have a chance of winning the ACC. And at number one, I have Georgia. This isn't even a discussion. I don't understand why the AP poll was split on who was getting number one votes. Georgia is the best team in the country. They've opened up the playbook finally on offense, and Carson Beck looks like a first-round quarterback all of a sudden. I don't know how or why. I don't know where that came from, because I've watched a lot of Georgia this year, and I did not think he had that in him. And then he came out and flat out proved me wrong against Kentucky. So that was my attempt at a top 25 poll, but we're going to end this video on something a little different, and that's a power ranking. And this is just straight up how good I think teams are. This is nothing to do with who they've played or who they've beaten this year. It has nothing to do with anything like that. This is strictly how good I think these teams are. And I'm going to do a top 10 because I don't have time to do a top 25, and also that would kind of really be really hard to do. At number 10, I have Alabama. At number 9, I have North Carolina. At number 8, I have Texas. At 7, I have Oklahoma because Oklahoma beat Texas. At 6, I have Florida State. These are all the teams that I think are playoff contenders, but not championship contenders. I don't think these teams can win a national championship, but I think they can make the playoffs and maybe win a game if they get an upset. So Alabama, I think what is holding them back is their offensive line play, which is improving, and their quarterback, which is also improving. But really the offense in general, I think if they play a team that can athletically match up with them, then they can effectively limit the offense. And we saw that versus Texas. I have North Carolina at 9. I think North Carolina is phenomenally underrated. I think that defense, kind of similar to Washington, when I said about Washington, I think that defense is just about as good as a defense can get with the caliber of offense that North Carolina is playing. I think Drake May really should be in the Heisman conversation. He isn't, but he should be in the Heisman conversation. I think right now I would probably have him third in that conversation. Michael Penix 1, Dylan Gabriel 2, Drake May 3. I have Texas at 8. They did beat Alabama, which is a good thing, but I had some concerns, and most of those concerns were surrounding Quinn Ewers. I think there's a very real possibility, and we saw this past week, that Quinn Ewers is holding back this Texas offense because of his inability to hit the deep ball consistently. If they hit the deep ball, this is a team that can win a national championship legitimately. But I don't think they can hit the deep ball with Quinn Ewers. Oklahoma at 7. I think Oklahoma is more consistent on offense and just less talented on defense than Texas. I think really they're tied. They should be tied, but I don't like putting ties on here. It's the same reason why I didn't have Tennessee and Washington State tied earlier on in the AP poll. even though technically they're both ranked 19. I just think that's dumb, so I didn't do it. At 6, I have Florida State, and Florida State is the one out of all of these teams where if we take them on their absolute best day against another one of these top 5 teams who are on their absolute best days, I think they're the team that has the best chance of winning that game. At number 5, I have Oregon, and 4, I have Washington. And this is another situation where, they probably should be tied, but I do honestly think Washington is slightly better than Oregon. And I think that largely has to come down to the fact that I don't trust Bo Nix and I do trust Michael Penix. I think that is somewhat the deciding factor. However, this is going to be answered this past week or this upcoming week. This is going to get answered. Who's the better team, etc., etc. And that will affect the power rankings. So right now, I do have Washington better than Oregon because it is my belief that Washington is better than Oregon. Could be proven wrong. I've talked about it in this video several times about how teams have proven me wrong. I'm not scared of being wrong because literally everybody is wrong all the time. So I don't really care if I'm proven wrong by another team. I'll talk about it. I'll openly admit it. Like, I thought Kentucky had a real chance of beating Georgia last week. They didn't. They got their ass beat. And I'll talk about it. I'll admit it. I'm not really all that concerned about it. I have Michigan at 3 and Georgia at 2 and Penn State at number 1. And that's probably what people are going to want to talk about with Penn State at number 1. I think Penn State is the best team in the country right now. Based on who they've played and how they've beaten all of those teams, I think Penn State is the best team in the country. And one of my biggest hot takes that I have so far this year is I think Michigan versus Ohio State is not going to matter on the national scale this year because I think they're both going to have losses to Penn State heading into that game. And Penn State, who plays Michigan State in their last game of the season the day prior to Michigan versus Ohio State, will have locked up a 12-0 Big Ten East championship by that point. And I don't think 11-1 in this year from a Big Ten second place team is going to be good enough to sneak into the playoffs as like a 4 seed or something like that. I think there are too many teams competing for the playoff. Like, I think you can effectively put in Alabama or Georgia if they play each other in the SEC championship game. I'm going to say Georgia. So I think you can lock in Georgia. You can lock in the Big Ten champion. And I think you can lock in the ACC champion, whether that's Florida State, North Carolina, or Louisville. I think you can lock them in, assuming Louisville is undefeated. But I think 12-1 Florida State or 12-1 North Carolina also get in as a lock. And then the last spot is probably going to go to the Pac-12 champion unless that conference eats itself alive. And if it does eat itself alive, then I think that likely goes to a 1-loss Texas or an undefeated Oklahoma team that makes the playoff. So even if the Pac-12 eats itself alive, it would then take an exuberant amount of other shit to happen in order for a non-conference champion to make the playoff this year. I said coming into this year several times in several different videos that I thought this year was going to be to the 12-team playoff what the 2013 season was to the 4-team playoff. Because a lot of people don't remember, 2013, they had 4 teams that were very clearly the 4 best teams in the country, and they were all kind of equal to each other, and they all had legitimate chances of making the national championship game and winning the national championship. And they had to pick 2, and they did pick 2, but I don't think they picked the right 2, but that's a discussion for a different day. Either way, I still stand by these power rankings. I still think Penn State is the best team in the country right now, from the level of talent that they have to the fact that they haven't shown blemishes like Georgia and Michigan have. Like, Georgia has shown that they are very vulnerable to the quarterback run game. Michigan has shown earlier on in the season that maybe J.J. McCarthy, if you can get him rattled a little bit, will kind of just collapse in on himself and sort of spiral downwards to go along with an offensive line that I think has taken a step back, even though they have been playing much better these past 2 weeks. I think they have taken a step back from last year, which was a step back from 2021, in my opinion, to go along with a defense that has shown cracks, even though they haven't played teams that have been able to exploit those cracks. We haven't seen anything like that from Penn State. So I think Penn State is the best team in the country. The last thing we're going to talk about here is the fact that I don't have USC
or Ohio State in these top 10 rankings. And that is for one simple reason. I think those two are the two fakest teams in the country. And I don't really have anything to say about them other than that. If you've seen them play, you understand why I believe that. And that is all that I have for you today. Thank you for watching if you made it all the way through here. So I would like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagreed with me at any point in the video, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below. Let's just remember to keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion, and I'll see you next time.